Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our virtual town hall meeting today. My name is Cindy Dodds, and I am the Director of Professional Development at ACSI. School leaders, teachers, and students have spent the last few weeks in crisis mode, responding to the unprecedented challenges of COVID-19. As we look to the coming months and the next school year, this town hall will explore the long-term impact of this pandemic on the education sector and help us to think through how we might uncover new opportunities for missional reach. These town halls provide a venue for you to hear what others are doing as they confront the current challenges, and they provide you the opportunity to get your questions answered among colleagues and friends. As we begin, we would love to know more about who is on our call today. Please take a moment to share your school information with us through the questions popping up on your screen at this time. After our panelists provide their insights, we will open the floor for your questions. If you have not already submitted questions via email, please begin submitting your questions now and throughout the meeting as those questions arise. You can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. These questions are being monitored, and we will present them to our panel. Before we move on to the introduction of our speaker, I would like to introduce you to my co-host and ACSI Vice President of USA, Dr. David Balick. David?
Well, thank you, Cindy. And again, thank you to you, Learning and Development Manager Sarah Longcar, and the entire PD team for all your hard work in getting us ready for today's town hall. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. John Murray wrote a great article recently for our friends at the Center for the Advancement of Christian Education entitled Hope in a Time of Crisis. And in the spirit of giving credit where credit is due, I want to thank John, since his article formed the basis of my devotional today. Murray begins his article by quoting J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where Frodo laments, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened," to which Gandalf replies, "So do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." Wise words from Gandalf, right? All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. So how then should we respond to times of crisis? Well, as we look back in time, the creative works, cures, and calls to kindness that have surfaced during periods of trial are actually quite amazing. Regarding innovation, our topic for today's town hall, Murray references the year without a summer, a phenomenon resulting from the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. The reduced sunlight due to volcanic ash led to a dramatic decrease in temperatures known as a volcanic winter, causing heavy rainfalls as well as snow and ice, which precipitated crop failures worldwide. Nevertheless, in the midst of this disruption, many innovators pioneered ahead during this unique window of time. One particular group of British writers retreated indoors to avoid the inclement weather while visiting Switzerland in 1816. It was here that they challenged each other with a contest to write the scariest story, resulting in what would become Mary Shelley's best-selling novel, Frankenstein. Redeeming her time, Shelley embraced the contest and glorified God with her cautionary tale. Not unlike Harvard, Stanford, and most of today's universities' response to the coronavirus, Cambridge University enacted social distancing by sending their students home during a plague outbreak in 1665 London. One Cambridge scholar used his God-given gifts at home, which would later be called his years of wonder. That scholar, a young Isaac Newton. Newton's time of quarantine brought forth revolutionary discoveries in calculus, laws of gravity and motion, and optic theory. Marveling at God's creation and inspiration, he would later write about his findings on motion and gravitation in Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets, he wrote, could proceed only from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord over all. While many secularists depict Christianity as a crutch for the weak during times of trial, time after time, historians have documented Christian men and women doing their best work in periods of uncertainty and suffering for the life of the world and the glory of God. Here's the thing. We don't have to be prominent writers, theologians, or scientists to express the most important act of hope in times of crisis, and that is love toward our neighbors. Amen? Wrestling with feelings of fear, loss of control, and anxiety are normal in our current situation. How we face these emotions, whether through our use of time or the manner in which we treat others, is our test. As Pastor Tim Keller writes in Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, nothing is more important than to learn how to maintain a life of purpose in the midst of painful adversity. Using our talents and gifts to love others and glorify God is not a crutch. Instead, it's what gives us hope and makes us whole. Amen. Let's pray together. Father, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to gather today. Thank you that you are a God of innovation. And Father, I thank you for each one represented on this Zoom, for the way in which they are serving their staff, parents, and students all around the world as your hands and your feet. Father, bless them, protect them, that we would know that we know that even though we can't see the whole path ahead, you give us enough light to take the next step. Father, we trust you for your continued guidance and provision for such a time as this. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, we're going to hear first from Dr. Lynn Swanner. Lynn is a dear friend and colleague. She serves as Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer here at ACSI, where she leads initiatives to address compelling questions and challenges facing Christian education. A published scholar and conference speaker, she is the lead editor of the books Mind Shift, Catalyzing Change in Christian Education, and Pivot, New Directions for Christian Education, as well as co-author of the book Bring It to Life, Christian Education and the Transformative Power of Service Learning. She is also the editor of the ACSI blog and host for the podcast Moving Forward in Christian Education. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, David and Cindy. And I just want to start by saying thanks to all the great Christian school leaders and educators on this town hall for really the heroic work you're doing during this time of challenge. And I think the first thing that we need to talk about before we can get into a conversation about innovation is the arc of experience that everyone in our schools is going through. And the sooner we recognize that, the sooner I think we can navigate it. And so to give an analogy, we have 3 school-age kids. They're actually in the other room. They're all doing distance learning through their Christian school, and their teachers are just doing a phenomenal job right now. But what my husband and I did at the beginning of this whole situation was we sat them down and we watched the movie Castaway, because we thought maybe we could give them some skills for what would surely be some extended time by themselves here with us in our house. And so the analogy is, if you think about that movie, when Tom Hanks first gets to the island, he's in survival mode. You know, he's flailing around. There's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of, smashing himself on the coral reef, and he's bleeding. And then he finally gets to the point to say, I made fire. And then he figures out how to survive. But as time goes on, he realizes that he's surviving, but he's not really thriving. He's not really flourishing. And so I think there's an analogy there for our teams, for our families, which is we need to help them to get past this initial shock and then move past this initial survival stage to help navigate them through the what does it mean stage. What does this mean for education? What does this mean for our schools? And we need to get to the acceptance point where we understand that the world has changed from what we once knew. It's not going back exactly to what we once knew. And I think once we can get to that point of acceptance, that's where we start seeing what's possible. And I've had it really, I found it very helpful to ask people, what are we grieving? What are we in love with? What are we missing? Is it our institutions? Is it our routines? Or are we missing people and relationships? And that's an important question. What are we in love with? And I think this is a really good time for us to fall back in love with our mission. Our mission doesn't change over time. It doesn't change with circumstance. So how we accomplish that mission certainly is changing, but I think we need to call ourselves, our schools, and our staff back to the right thing to be in love with, which is our mission. So with that groundwork laid, that framework, to get us into the conversation about innovation, I'd start with a question that I'd pose to you, which is, what has set your Christian school apart from many other sectors of schools in your community during this time? What has your value proposition been as compared to other kinds of schools? And I think there are two answers, and they really provide the keys for how we can innovate going forward. Number one, our schools have proven literally overnight that they can be nimble when they need to be. And education is one of the least nimble fields that there is. And there's some good reasons for that. They're not all bad reasons, but our private schools are not as bound by as many restrictions as the public school sector. And so that nimbleness is really something that can set our schools apart. We can respond quickly to challenges. And the second value proposition is, we obviously attend to the deeper questions in life, the spiritual side, those questions like that always come up during times of crisis. What does this mean? How should we live in light of what's happening? And we handle those questions by loving and caring others. And generally speaking, we have smaller communities that can take care of one another. And so we can really show the love of Christ, which also sets us apart. And so I think going forward, we need to bind that nimbleness and our Christian mission together. And that's the way forward in the coming years. So I want to give you some examples, and I'll pull those examples using the chapters of the Mind Shift book as examples. So that'll sort of be my organizing principle. And so as a sector, we've obviously really gone through a mind shift. We've been forced to do that pretty much overnight. We've had to take unavoidable challenges, and we've got to reframe them as opportunities in order to navigate them. And that is really the crux of the mind shift. So if we start out with the first chapter, moving towards an education that's built for human beings as opposed to machines. If we really think about it, what we had pre-COVID-19 in most of education often didn't work. A lot of it didn't really propel students towards deeper learning, didn't prepare them for 21st century learning, and didn't really offer the opportunity to be personalized. And I'm talking education in general. I'm not necessarily talking about your school or your situation. I'm just talking about if we look at education writ large. Education writ large is fairly mechanistic. It's very focused on content, a lot of regurgitation, and not a lot of opportunity for students to become creators and collaborators. And so with that said, what we need to do right now is to make sure wherever that exists in our schools, and it exists to some extent in most of our schools, we need to not port that over into our new platforms and our new delivery systems. So this is a really good time to think about how we do school in general and how we can help students become more creative so they can really be better prepared for that Ephesians 2 life. They can be better prepared to do the good works, to walk in them that God's prepared beforehand for them. When we think about the chapter isolated to networked, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a head of school in the Harrisburg area, Phil Paleo, and it was on a podcast about mergers. And he said something that I thought was great. He said, the landscape of education is screaming for collaboration. And my question through all this has been, why are we going it alone here? We have some really golden opportunities to share intellectual capital and even some potential costs through this. And so I think it's critical to stay connected, get outside of yourself and your school. Many schools are doing that, but I've also seen some schools literally reinventing the wheel, teacher by teacher, class by class. So this is a great opportunity to connect with other leaders, connect your teachers with other teachers, and learn from one another. Will Richardson from Modern Learners tweeted something great the other day. He said, we can only do as many design sprints as we want, but if this moment teaches us anything, change is a marathon. So we've been doing design sprints to survive, but we need to start thinking about this is a marathon, and that's going to require us to rely on one another. I also think about the Gutenberg to 5G chapter. Mitch Salerno is a co-author for that chapter, and he's one of our panelists today. And all of our Luddite excuses have been taken away. You know, many leaders have been saying they couldn't get their teachers to try anything online a few months ago, and now they've been thrown into the deep end of the pool. And that fear of the unknown is gone. You may not be happy about it, but it's gone. And that's half the battle for change. And there's also a great Forbes article that came out the other day, and I would encourage you, I know we'll share it in the links, but it says that it's very compelling. It says with 12 to 18 months toward a vaccine, today's changes are likely here to stay in one form or another. So in other words, this, you know, sort of toggling back and forth that may happen in next year between, oh, we can be in person, then we have to toggle back to online, that sort of blended approach to learning. If we have a year of that or so, that, you know, it takes 3 weeks to form a habit, that's going to become the new normal. And so they say this is going to be just part of a student's life, even, yes, in K to 12, but also even into college. And so we need to prepare ourselves and our schools for the very real reality of blended learning going forward, almost regardless of whatever happens with COVID-19. The chapter White to Mosaic, you know, this crisis is an absolute test for access and inclusion in education. The current moment opens up all kinds of access opportunities where we are able to reach students and families like never before, but it also opens up challenges for underserved students. And so you have to ask the question, how is everybody of all backgrounds and abilities participating in your community fully? How do they belong? This crisis affects people disproportionately in different communities. If families have a parent or both that's an essential worker or a single parent, or families from a lower socioeconomic status who may not have the same access to technology or internet. What if parents can't stay home with their kids? And so we need to think through these things so that knowing that we're called to serve and value families of all backgrounds, just as Jesus did. And then finally, siloed to engaged. You know, this is a real chance for us to care for our community. What do we offer in Christ that's unique and different? What is that hope that we can bring? How do we bless our communities for good, sharing the love and the light of Christ? And just one small example, a Christian school that I know had to take all their prep for AP, obviously online. Well, what they did was open those sessions up to the community and offered it to the public school students. That's a great way just to bless their community. And there are a lot of tangible examples out there. But again, that's really showing our value proposition, but we have to live up to that proposition. We have to back it up with real action. So those are just some thoughts on the mind shift we've been going through. I'll close by pointing folks to a blog post that I recently wrote with Dan Behrens and with Eric Ellison, who are the other editors of Mind Shift, and it's called Disruption, Disorientation, and Disequilibrium. Now what? And I think we'll share that link as well. And in that blog post, we quote Bill Latham, who's a friend, and he's also a panelist on this call. And he says, innovation comes from pain. And I love that quote. And this blog post helps us to think through that, how that can happen. How do we get from pain to innovation? And really, if you look at the research, we learn as adults by building in time for reflection and questioning. So I'd refer you to the blog post. There's some great reflective questions you can use. I've heard from leaders that they're going through that with themselves and then with their teams, and they're broadening it out. And then the final thing I'll say is don't make reflection one and done. Keep asking, what are we learning? What new skills and mindsets are we building? What do we want to keep? How are we adapting? And how are we better positioning ourselves to fulfill our missions into the future?
Thank you, Lynn, for sharing your thoughts. You are correct. We have been in survival mode, and we are all trying to get to a place where we can thrive. We are preparing for the marathon. Lynn challenged us with the question, are we in love with our mission? If so, how can we deliver it moving forward? How can we challenge students to become more creative? How can we become more collaborative? How can we minister to a more diverse community? How can we bless our communities? All very important questions as we rethink our Christian school models. She left us with some encouragement as well. We have learned that in Christian education, we can be nimble. So let's do it. David, back to you.
Well, we have a number of questions coming in, Cindy, and we are anxious to get to them. But before we do, our panelists are going to introduce themselves and share their unique insights in light of today's topic. Let's begin with Bill Latham. Bill is co-author of the book, Humanizing the Education Machine, How to Create Schools that Turn Disengaged Students into Inspired Learners, and the brand new book, Whole, What Teachers Need to Help Students Thrive. He's also CEO and Senior Program Designer at Meteor Education, a company that inspires and supports communities and their students in creating transformational learning experiences. And he's the founder of the International EdShift Conference. Great to have you with us here today, Bill. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David and Lynn. I so resonated with some of what she shared. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I want to share with you at least a word of encouragement that came as part of some time I was spending in reflection. It's out of the book of Habakkuk. It's in chapter 3, verse 17 through 19. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. So some bad economic times, apparently. Yet will I rejoice in the Lord, and I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Now, being a Southern boy, I didn't really understand what Habakkuk was talking about in chapter 3, verse 17 through 19, when he talked about a deer on high places. Because where I'm from, fluffy white-tailed deer don't climb on high places all that often. So I actually looked well, I don't know that I can share my screen, so I won't, but I'm going to give you the name Nubian ibex. The Nubian ibex is the deer actually that Habakkuk was looking at. If you Google the Nubian ibex and look at the kind of thing that Habakkuk would have been describing, these are deer that actually scale sheer cliffs. And when I say sheer cliffs, I mean near 180-degree cliffs as a means of escaping predators. And they have amazing, it's an amazing video to watch. It's an amazing photo to see. When I realized what Habakkuk was looking at and realized how God had equipped those deer to deal with the situation that was in front of them, I understood the verse. And that is that you and I are uniquely equipped, and your staffs are uniquely equipped to deal with a time like this. And so what I'd like to do in thinking about where we lead maybe to innovation is to make sure that we get to the point where we can innovate. In other words, there's sort of a survival mentality that Lynn pointed to here. So I want to give you maybe a few mental models that might be helpful. Can I share my screen now? Okay, here we go. Nubian ibex, world premiere for those of you who have not seen the Cliff Walkers. And I will show you one other photo just for fun. Once again, this is a Nubian wall walker, because this is actually a dam that they're walking up, and they're so compelled to lick the salt that they'll scale the sheer walls of this dam. So that gives you some idea of what Habakkuk would have been looking at and talking about. So anyway, I want three kind of streams of thought I think that you and your teams need to think about being in here. We certainly understand short-term and the emergency operations that a lot of schools immediately had to deal with. So a short-term group of thought is around a 60 to 90-day period of time. And then you have the school year coming, and I think there's a midterm set of thought to focus on what is school going to be like in this 2021 era. And then there's a long-term set of thought that you want to spend time on. And so if you can kind of organize yourself into those three streams of thought, the short term that we've seen really nationally is how do we, and of course we serve both the public and private sector as an organization, how do we feed kids? How do we set up emergency distance learning? How do we mitigate stakeholder expectations, particularly parent expectations? My last daughter attends a private Christian school, and I've enjoyed some of the town halls there, and looking at questions from parents like, since we're not really doing school, do we have to pay tuition? And so mitigating stakeholder expectations is a thing, and really dealing with cash flow, because likely it's more expensive to engage in distance learning since most schools aren't set up to do that. And at the same time, there's this sort of downward pressure coming from either students that might make alternative decisions or whatnot. So the short term is not really where I want to spend a lot of time, but I do think it's important that that's a part of your planning. Where I'd really like to spend most of my time in focus here would be on what I call midterm 2020-2021 school year. What should we be thinking about? What is out there? And as a school leader, what am I to do? There was a gentleman by the name of Viktor Frankl who wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning. He was a World War II Jewish prisoner. And to summarize a lot of the work that he had, those who saw that they had choice and control in their response to the situation they found themselves, in other words, they exerted agency, tended to live in concentration camps, and those who saw themselves as victims died. I think it's very important that we convey to our staffs that while we cannot control everything about the situation, that for all intents and purposes, we are focused on controlling with some level of agency. So we've recommended people think about 4 kinds of work teams that they form to give people in their organization, not just the leader, valid work to do that's helpful to the organization in this midterm thinking. And that's an internal communication. How do we talk to our employees and our staff about what's going on? An external messaging and marketing group, a cash and contingency group. How can we do better? And then a get ready to pounce group that's really thinking in this midterm and long term about such questions as, when we come back in the fall, how do we physically distance on campus? How do we collaborate in a post-COVID world? And how do we engage some of the other 4 C's, rigor, complexity, communication, critical thinking? And then how are we going to plan for those disruptions that Lynn was describing? Emergency planning all of a sudden takes on a new meaning. We're in Florida, so we plan for hurricanes. There's a new hurricane in town. And so in thinking about that, when we wrote the book Whole, we were really looking at the trauma that our teachers are experiencing in the teaching profession, the students coming in, and that is only amplified in the current scenario. We have people who have lost family and colleagues. A principal that we're familiar with in New York and that we work with has lost 5 principal colleagues in that state. And so there's a significant amount of trauma that is present today. And in the economic crisis and the health crisis, we will continue to see our students coming back with greater levels of trauma. And so the book Whole is really addressing how to help teachers in that scenario. But one of the ultimate gets from the book for me in participating in it was that during these kinds of crises, that people need humanity, they need humility, and they need a sense of community. And so for some of these midterm challenges, I think one of the things you'll have to do with that group, if you have a ready to pounce and how are we going to take advantage of what we see happening out there kind of group, you're going to have to challenge some of the traditional assumptions you have about marketing and enrollment very quickly, because we all know that this is a cash flow game, and there are a lot of people who in this time are going to be reevaluating their family finances. They're going to be reevaluating kids at home, kids in other kinds of education scenarios. I think you're going to have to invest more time in planning for unplanned disruptions and in teachers and training them to be comfortable with tools, particularly digital tools that'll bring students that are in a class and students that are somewhere else together. And then I think we're really going to have to focus on emotional resonance with students. How are they resonating with the content we're delivering online? Because that's a leading indicator of engagement. And then we're talking about in the long-term scenario, it's a magic 8 ball right now. There are things you can turn the magic 8 ball over that might say yes, no, like, is this going to change education? You turn the magic 8 ball over and it says yes. But when you think about how is it going to change education, or is it going to be this or that, there are a lot of things that come up in the magic 8 ball, which is ask again later. And it's one of the reasons why we think it's important to develop these teams and then to regularly have the teams evaluating the situation on an ongoing basis, because there are things that we simply cannot answer right now, but we're going to have to start to ask the questions and watch for best practices. Kind of in conclusion, I'll just say this. I think this is a Passover season. I think it's a Passover season in education. I think it's a Passover season in Christian education. And maybe moving from program and staff driven to engaged, more congregationally with our students is going to be the order of the day. Smaller and more intimate engagement and better platform delivery. I think they're here to stay. And with that, we'll turn it back over to David.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Bill. Now let's welcome Dr. Angela Patterson. Angela is the Superintendent of Teaching and Learning for the International Schools Consortium and Leadership Development International. Dr. Patterson, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here and to join you. I join you tonight, actually in the morning. I'm in Qingdao, China, and where I live and work. And the International Schools Consortium, I represent 6 schools here in China. One of our schools is actually located in Wuhan. And so we have been responding to COVID-19 since the end of January. And so the lessons that we have learned, we see God's hand and we see his timing and not our timing. But our story, specifically in the area of innovation, really comes from asking God the question several years ago of what comes next. And so 10 years ago, our schools were called International Schools of China. And we were several sister schools that shared a few touch points, but operated fairly autonomously. And so even at that time, we were approached by others who were interested in what we were doing and operating schools with a strong Christian ethos in a closed country. And so when asked, we were able to recommend we weren't able to recommend a given curriculum or structure or way of doing things because we had multiple ways of doing things. And so we weren't sustainable. We had programs that were started by staff who left the schools, and things began to change over and over and over again. And so 2.5 years ago, I was tasked with launching what we've called the integration project. And it has been to take these autonomous schools and move them into more shared practices and something like a district model. And so, as you can imagine, that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, building a team, doing a lot of research. We visited other international schools who had tackled change on a large scale. And when you talk about innovation, it impacts change, and it is change, and that change management. And so we read Cotter's Leading Change, we read Dweck's Mindset, we visited these other schools and really tried to glean as much as possible at that time. And that was 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago. So I really believe that God was setting us up for what's happening now. I would never wish COVID-19 on the world, but at the same time, I can see God's hand moving, and what the enemy means for evil, that God uses for good. And so even in the midst of trying to plan and launch this integration project, and that has been, we focused on building our curriculum review cycle, building around our curriculum review cycle to implement the changes over a period of time, and to get people talking across the schools that shared the same jobs, so that, again, we were collaborating and working more as a system. And so we determined that even at that time, we needed something that was going to be sustainable and scalable. And I think these are some of the lessons that we've previously learned that are helping us now. We also wanted to look for something that would be able to be multiplied. We believe in multiplicative movements of sharing the gospel and spreading the gospel. And so what are ways that we can foster that within education settings? And so through a series of conversations, work, communications, we created what we call communities of practice. And those, you can imagine, they closely resemble professional learning communities where teachers are able to talk with one another. First grade teachers, secondary science, HR managers, facilities personnel, But it's the place where we, my team, can learn about what types of continued training and professional development might be most valuable to those groups. But even in the midst of those groups, we needed teacher leaders from across the district that could lead those communities to practice. And so we created a role, district instructional leaders, and we try to have pairs of teachers sending out in twos and working together in twos to build sustainability, as in the international school setting, we have a great amount of transiency and teacher turnover. And so oftentimes these teacher leaders are potential leaders who just need more practice and training. They're passionate about their subject or their age levels, but they're young. Or they're natural leaders who don't want to leave the classroom. And so how do we leverage those teacher leaders and really gain more knowledge from them? How do we create systems and structures to feed the information to the right people so that we're able to get the best kind of learning for on-the-job trainings, continued understandings, and really embracing andragogy and that adult learning theory. And so the biggest challenge, frankly, I hope my encouragement to you is that even in this midst of COVID, and as Bill said, thinking about more of that midterm and long term, they're the small starts, identifying what are the small starts, what are your small wins. And so for us, that was a shared time to meet, and it was 45 minutes a month that all the staff in an entire school could gather on a Zoom call for their community of practice. And so getting them together. But once teachers connected, they wanted a way to communicate. And so we've been able to leverage additional technology tools. And we redesigned our annual conference to build face-to-face meeting times in addition to those Zoom calls. And so teachers have been able to work on units together and discuss shared policies, practices, and moving forward. And so we were actually 4 semesters into this 8-semester project when COVID-19 hit. And as you can imagine, it hit us hard. We were on Chinese New Year holiday when we were notified that our schools would not reopen after the Chinese New Year holiday. I am pleased to announce that actually even this last week, we had 2 of our China schools be able to open to a small group of students. And so that's a huge praise, and we give all the glory to God for those reopenings. And so there is hope, there's light at the end of the tunnel. But in the midst of this COVID-19, we were immediately able to activate these district instructional leaders and communities of practice so that teachers are able to share a bit of the burden, and we were able to draw on our groups of leaders together for that regular check-in for mutual encouragement and understanding, as well as to identify what are the areas of well-being for both our staff and for our students. And then even as we return to school, how do we address the trauma? And so the things that we want to remember as we continue to move forward in our innovation as a system of schools is teachers now see the felt need for curriculum across a really robust learning platform. Our parents are ready, our teachers are ready to have a singular instance that we can actually leverage for communication and for curriculum planning and consolidation. Teachers and leaders are re-examining their assessment practices. We've revisited the standards. They're looking more closely to evaluate what is the essential knowledge and skills, and finding creative ways for students to demonstrate that learning. And then as well as re-examining their reporting practices. So we are now even looking at how do we best communicate with students and parents how these children are progressing. Whether they be in kindergarten or whether they be in 10th grade, what are the best ways for students to demonstrate their learning to their parents, and how do we best help parents to understand what their students know and what they need to know. And then finally, our next steps are looking at taking a close look at the pedagogy for distance and online learning. And as an organization, we believe that connection and relationship are essential to fostering disciple making. And so we're working to identify the practices that teachers are currently using that are reaping results so that those can be captured and that we can actually collect those and put them into those future online learning opportunities. So that's just a little bit about our our journey in the midst of things.
Wow, so rich. Thank you so much, Dr. Patterson. Whatever we do, collaboration is so important, right? Scalability, sustainability, fantastic. Well, next up, we have Dr. Mitch Salerno, head of school at Monte Vista Christian School in Watsonville, California. So out to the West Coast here. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Salerno.
Well, David, thank you for allowing me to be here, and it's good to be here with all of you, and Lynn and Bill and Angela. Thank you for all the things that you said in advance of my opportunity to share. And it's great to stand on your shoulders, because many of the things that you have shared have been on my mind. I want to start with a quote from a good friend of mine, David Michelle, who's at White Rock Christian School up in, or White Rock Christian Academy up in Vancouver, Canada. About a year or two ago, I was spending some time with him, and he said to me, you know, Mitch, everyone changes either by choice or they change by default. And that's so true in this day and age. We either change by choice or we change by default. Many of us, many of you, have been thrust into change through a default. It wasn't necessarily what you chose, it's what's happened to you. But I want to submit to you that how you move from here could be an opportunity to change or innovate by choice. And there's a lot of open opportunities for you to be able to change. I want to give you some good news and some bad news. Lynn already alluded to some of this in her words. The good news is many of us have changed by default. The utilization of technology. You are using Zoom, for example, or possibly a learning management system of some sort that maybe it wasn't as important. Google Classroom, Moodle, you name which one you would like. And all of a sudden you're using it more efficiently than you've ever been using. And that's good news. You've changed by default. But there's some bad news. I've been hearing around education circles, many folks saying that in this time, their rapid increase in the use of technology has turned into, look how great we can innovate. When in fact, I want to submit to you that the use of technology is not innovation, especially in the year 2020. The use of say Zoom and our gathering together, and I see that there are 333 participants from around the world because Angela is in China. That's not innovation. That's the utilization of a tool that has been present for decades. Maybe not Zoom in particular, but this type of tool has been utilized for a while. We're just identifying it to meet a felt need. And so this was not changed by choice, it was changed by default. So it's one of the things I want to submit to you to begin thinking, since we have this paradox between good news and bad news, and I don't want to minimize the good news, we have made some significant shifts, is what is the difference between remote learning and remote schooling? In fact, if you would like, you can remove the words remote, because I think this was a salient and relevant question 4 months ago. We just weren't in a position to ask it. Because one of the things, and I appreciated, David, your devotion about all of the previous times when we faced crisis and there was significant change. It's true that the changing of constraints often always drives innovation. And so one of the simplest ways you can innovate in any organization at any time, not even in a crisis, is to alter the constraints. And that will force people to change. Why? Because the rules of the game change. And when the rules of the game change, people have to find new ways to play the game. They have to find a new way to solve a problem because you've altered the rules. So 4 or 5 months ago, pre-COVID, we weren't asking questions of what's the difference between learning and schooling, or at least we probably weren't asking them. We should have been asking them. Now we ask the question, what's the difference between remote learning and remote schooling? Why is this such an important question? Because many of us, I believe, are finding out, back to the good news, bad news, that while we were able to shift what we were doing to a remote or online format, doesn't ensure that what we're actually doing is any good. And that's the next big question of innovation, I think, that we as Christian schools face, is, are we actually learning? Are our kids learning? So it made me think of, and in the few minutes that I have by way of introduction, hopefully this forces and encourages questions from you, are things like, what are our assessment practices in our classrooms? I've heard stories of elementary schools, middle schools, even my own school. We're a middle school and high school, where some of our teachers are doing a really fantastic job. I don't want to minimize what they're doing, but some of our teachers are struggling because they can't give assessments the way they've always given assessments. The question is not how do we adapt the technology to that form of assessment? The question that we should be asking is that the right form of assessment? Is there a different way to assess that has more efficacy, that does value relationship and learning and is better? This time of COVID can force us to ask those questions. It force us to ask questions about engagement. I think that there's been a passivity related to engagement in the classroom that we've allowed to exist for a long period of time. And this time of COVID, when we're on Zoom or on Google Hangouts or whatever platform we might choose, I think that we need to be asking questions related to engagement. There's a myriad of other questions where we can innovate. I know I saw some questions and some comments as I was looking as others were talking. I think this calls for a time to think about our management principles, our communication dynamics within our school, our collaboration tolerance. That's the thing that I was thinking about, is what is the tolerance for collaboration in your organization? This time of COVID will highlight what your community's collaboration tolerance is. It's going to affect our business models, how our finances, how we write our contracts, procedures and policies. I know in our school, we've come to a new sensitivity to signing long-term contracts for things like trips. Maybe you experienced that in the last 4 months, where contracts that you thought were certain, you would have signed them very quickly. Now maybe you're not quite so quick to sign. So as we think about these times, I think Bill had mentioned something that was really good, is this what is going to happen in the immediate, in the short immediate, middle term, and then long term. And I think as you begin to move forward, I would love for you to begin to consider the difference between remote learning and remote schooling. Is what you're doing now good? What I mean by that is that something that you are proud to take forward. And if we are in a period of toggling or remote learning for 12, 18 months or longer, is or are the practices that your school is putting forward, are they forward thinking? I'll leave you with one anecdotal story. We have a program here, we call it Taking Flight, and Taking Flight is where we have our new enrollees come to campus. We obviously couldn't do that this year. We moved it fully online. And as a result of that program, we saw 6 families who were not enrolled in our school who participated, immediately enrolled. And one family who had not even applied, immediately applied to the school as a result of the online format and the way we produced the event online. And when we asked them why, they saw how we cared, how we innovated, and how we utilized this new methodology to meet the needs of our families. And they immediately joined us. So I think there are opportunities for you to innovate. I look forward to the questions. And so Cindy, I throw it back to you.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you all for sharing such wonderful insights. We want to invite all of our panel members back on the screen at this time. And let's get to our questions. Our first question, what are the top 3 considerations schools should make when beginning a contingency plan for beginning a new school year remotely? Mitch covered a few of them. He talked about our assessment practices, engagement, communication, and collaboration. But what are the top 3? Anyone have thoughts? Top 3 considerations. Lynn.
I'll take a stab at it. I think, we've a lot of us have been watching things that have come out from Forbes and from other articles, and someone referenced the Kennesaw State letter, and just from being around schools and seeing what needs to happen. I think, and I don't know how I'd order these. I think the number one question, obviously on everyone's mind, is enrollment. What that's going to look like, what our student body will look like in light of the uncertainty. And so I think it's really smart to be doing contingency planning based on that, but not from a perspective of we're going to lose but more along the lines of what Mitch just shared, which are where are opportunities that we can actually use this to recruit and show our value proposition. So I would say to be doing contingency planning for enrollment, but not to do it from a place of total loss, but to be thinking about what are the opportunities here. I think also the points that were made in terms of instruction are key. You've got to be thinking about what instruction is going to look like, whether we're toggling back and forth in and out. You've got to be getting feedback from your families and your students. The reality is that I saw something today, I don't know how reliable it was, and I have to look more deeply, but it was out there, a report that said something like 40 or 50% of families that are finding themselves homeschooling at this point are actually enjoying it and seeing benefits to it. So, you know, you've got to be able to think about what instruction is going to look like now that everyone has had a taste of the flexibility of being online and also the pains and the joys. So you got to think about that. And I think the last, and again, these are not in any particular order, I think community is critical. You've got to think about what your community looks like, how you continue to build community, how you invite those from outside your school in, help your students who are in your school go out, and those distinctives, how you build community, how you show Christ's love, and how you relate with one another. And that goes to what Bill was talking about. So I think enrollment, instruction, and community are some of the top three.
Looks like Mitch has something else to add there.
And Lynn, I think you hit it, because I wrote my list while you were talking, and the number one thing on my list was relationships, which I think ties to this idea of community. I think that one of the things that this has always been a problem with technology, and I think that it's something that we're learning now that we probably could have learned decades ago, is we often saw, and I heard this through all the years I've been speaking on technology, is that technology is impersonal. And what we're finding is that technology is not impersonal. Impersonal people are impersonal. And what we're seeing even in how we're delivering this format right now, and I'm thinking back to the banter that we had when the group of the panel was on here before we even came on, is that we were physically separated but emotionally present, and there was an opportunity for us to connect. So I think that relationships, connection, how you're delivering how you're delivering the gospel, how you're delivering learning, is not impinged by the medium that we're utilizing to deliver this content. And so I think that's number one. The other one, you hit the nail on the head. I put the word flexibility. I think people are going to crave flexibility. I think there are parts of this time that we're not going to want to give up. And I think that if we try to shove what we had previous back into what the future is, I don't think it's going to work. I think we're going to have to be nimble and flexible. And then lastly, I started with it in my talk, but just learning, focusing on learning. So I appreciate that, Lynn. That was really good stuff.
Excellent. Bill, go right ahead, brother. And then we'll get to our next question.
I will not do three. I will simply do two things to maybe add or amplify. I agree with what's been said. Great answers. I think the people connection of people coming back to work or school is something that everybody will have to think about in sort of how we're ministering to people and meeting them where they are. There are those that are going to be very eager to get back to school, both from a student's perspective and more importantly, really from a teacher's perspective. I think secondly, there are going to be some that are willing to come back but are hesitant, and that is a different animal altogether. And I think a third one is there are those we were just describing, Lynn was just describing, that have found new freedom, and we want them to be in our school community, and we both economically and in terms of ministry, but at the same time, we're going to have to deal with the fact they've found a new freedom here, and this is an opportunity again for us to widen what our physical space wouldn't allow for, but the community of the school to get better. And then there is a group that is going to be simply afraid to come back. And even in the Christian community, there will be people who are afraid to come back and afraid to be in proximity. And so if we're going to be human about this, we're going to have to think about, I think, all four groups and how we deal with that. The other thing I'd throw out, because I am the space guy, is how is physical and what is physical space used for now? The answer for us is probably going to be found in some mix of the custodial aspect of schools. Elementary kids really can't sit home while mom and dad are gone. And so there's going to be an expansion of the use of spaces available if we're going to physically distance, and also how we're going to collaborate or do hands-on work. But the classroom is a place of control, maintaining control, if you will, of people's attention, that is a thing that's going to be challenged in this. And so how we think about physical space and what it's useful for and what it's not useful for on a go-forward basis, I think is important.
Wow, fantastic. Excellent. Well, hey, we have another question that came in asking about your thoughts on implementing a hybrid program. Anybody have any thoughts as it relates to a hybrid program? Dr. Patterson, I see your head nodding.
That's part of my responsibilities right now, is what happens because China has closed its borders when our teachers can't get back even and our students are here. And so we are working with a variety of contingencies of what does this hybrid model look like? How do we continue to engage our school communities and those that want to be part of our school communities who are unable to return to our schools? And so, yes, having teachers teach from a distance, having teachers on site, having students on site, having students at a distance, and what are some of the opportunities? And so what we're specifically looking at is looking at various calendars. What does 3 different calendars possibly look like, 3 different contingencies there, as well as how do we navigate our learning management system that we have had traditionally, 6 or 7 different ones across our schools, but actually we're in the process even now of developing and getting onto one platform. And so thinking through what are the practical strategies in delivering a hybrid program, as well as being flexible and ready to receive what government expectations will happen as well.
You go ahead, Dr. Salerno.
You know, I think it's an interesting question. I wish that we were in a format. This is one of my wish was with the person who asked the question, because I'd like a clarifying question on that. But I'll give some thoughts on this idea. What we mean by hybrid, I think, really makes a difference. So, for example, here in California, some of the stuff that is being kind of bantered about, I appreciate Bill's comment about the magic 8 ball. We don't know what's coming, but there are thoughts that we might have to move because of physical distancing or social distancing to kind of a half on, half off type of a system where your kids are coming half of the group one day, half of the group the next day in order to maintain space. I think that I would caution schools against over innovating here and just going to try to guess what they think hybrid is going to need to be and creating some form of a system to fill some perception of what a future need of hybrid is going to be. I think I'm back to this word learning. I think the best thing you can do to prepare for a hybrid model is ask questions about what is learning? What does it mean to be a learner? And to devise a system that is about good learning. So I know our friend Dan Behrens does work in deeper learning and those types of areas. I think if we ask the right questions around what is learning and we design a system that's around learning, that will be nimble and flexible, whether we're in person, whether we're at a distance, whether we're half on, whether we're half off. So that's where I would kind of take that question. It's hard if we don't have that person in front of us to kind of focus us, but that's where I would go. I'd be really reticent to start building systems right now, presuming that you know what the future holds.
Wow, I can't believe we're out of time already. What a great group of panelists we've had. I think we could have gone on for another hour. But as we close out the town hall portion of our meeting, we encourage you to continue conversations on the ACSI community group thread dedicated to this discussion. You can find a link to that discussion on our coronavirus homepage at acsi.org. You will also find the link to today's recording there. We have been looking for ways to bless our schools during this period, and one way we hope to do that is by offering a free subscription to ACSI Connexus Premium from now until June 15th for our member schools. Premium hosts over 500 teacher development courses on 40 topic-based channels for teachers' individualized learning. You'll find the link to register at acsi.org. I sincerely hope you will join us next week for our town hall on Wednesday with a focus on early education, managing anxiety and grief during uncertain times. Your host will be Sarah Jo Dillard, and she will introduce you to our guest speaker, Sarah Thompson. You will also see a new idea emerging for next week with a town hall especially designed for parents. On Thursday, April 30th, we encourage you to create a Facebook watch party and engage with your parents at your school on a personal level while our ACSI president, Dr. Larry Taylor, deals with the topic, Kingdom Parenting Meets COVID-19. Here, Dr. Taylor will share his heartfelt passion for the value of parent partnership in Christian education. Our parent panelists from several of our Christian schools will share how they are coping with the pandemic and keeping the Lord at the center. Please check out the coronavirus website for ongoing updates regarding these opportunities. Stay tuned. There will be more relevant topics to come. David?
Well, thank you again, Cindy. God is really using these town halls mightily. We would now like to invite everyone to join a regional chat room. We're also hosting an international and early education chat room. These chat rooms will allow you to have more discussion together with your colleagues and talk with them about how they're handling this issue. These Zoom meetings are hosted by your ACSI directors. We're providing the links in the chat panel at this time. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists, our special guests. We hope this time was an encouragement and a blessing to you. Please consider joining our Monday Connection Time with ACSI President Dr. Larry Taylor for a short devotion, ACSI update, and Q&A time. In addition, on Monday, we have our Legal Legislative Hour, and during this hour, our Legal Legislative team is live with updates, and they will take your questions as well. You can register for these virtual events on the coronavirus webpage. Let's head to the chat rooms now, and thank you again for joining us today.